we will kick off with this final session of Stronger Things. So we thought it'd be quite nice to end with a really detailed look at community power, as that is obviously the driving force behind what we're doing at New Local, and driving force behind obviously a lot of what everyone is doing who's been part of this session has obviously been the key theme of Stronger Things. So we have three really fantastic members of our research team who are going to be doing very brief presentations, only about 5 minutes each, and then we're going to open up to questions. So do use the chat to ask any question that occurs to you around community power, anything that's been worrying you, or anything that arises out of the presentations. We're going to be hearing from Simon Kay, who's senior researcher, and I suppose it's sort of like one of our key theorists of community power, if you like, at New Local, having written our excellent report, which was published last year on Elinor Ostrom, who we see as a sort of intellectual grandmother, if you like, of the community power idea. So Simon's going to talk a bit about that. We're also going to hear from Grace Pollard and Jessica Studdert, who were both co-authors on a report we published just a couple of weeks ago now, I think, which was called Community Power, the Evidence, which brought together all the evidence of the impact that community power can have, but actually also did a really good job, I think, of bringing together loads and loads of case studies around community power, sort of practical examples of where community power is being tried. So they're both excellent people to draw on to talk about the impact, but also the practice of community power. So we'll kick off with Simon, who is going to talk about the idea of community power. Off you go, Simon.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, and I've limited myself to three things about Elinor Ostrom's work, which is, as my colleagues will know, very difficult for me. There's something like 103 things that are interesting about Elinor Ostrom's work, and I've been boring my colleagues to death with some of this stuff for quite a long time now. But no, so the report that came out last year was called Think Big, Act Small. And really, we dug out three overlapping, very important ideas that were really revolutionary when Ostrom put them forward, and should have overturned a lot of the consensus, a lot of the assumptions that revolve around the obstacles to what we're calling community power at this event, and what we've been hearing about over these last 3 mornings. So I'm interested in addressing those obstacles, and I think Elinor Ostrom provides us with a very evidence-based set of theories and ideas to help us to understand how to do it. So 3 big overlapping ideas. First of all, and most famously, the approach that got Elinor Ostrom her Nobel Prize, first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, is the idea of self-governance of the commons. And the orthodoxy before Elinor Ostrom made strides in this area, the completely unquestioned orthodoxy, was that under situations where there's scarce resources, a community can't hope to manage things in a sustainable and environmentally friendly way, in a way that actually manages everyone's expectations. Instead, you need some kind of outside supervision or regulation to get the job done. You need the state to totally monopolize and then piece out the resources, or you need the market to come in with private property rights in order to do so. This is an orthodoxy that has dictated the terms for the way that we think about the disposition of resources in local areas and at the national scale too, for hundreds of years. And Elinor Ostrom pretty much debunked it altogether, which is why she's particularly powerful, and it's completely understandable why that's her most famous contribution. Overlapping with that is a kind of a larger scale and democratically informed case for decentralization. A lot of this stuff that we were hearing about during sessions yesterday, actually, the idea for decentralization, scaling down the mode of operation and the kind of the level, the tier at which a lot of decisions get made and a lot of participation can function. So when you do that, you win, says Ostrom, a lot of gains that you might otherwise lose. You win informality. You win the capacity for co-production, which can only plausibly take place at a very localized, very nearby scale. And this, I think, adds up in our context, in the UK, in England in particular, for a really important case for further devolution and for further autonomy to be granted to local places. So instead of assuming that what we should be fighting for when we talk about public services and achieving good things with our policies is economies of scale, of finding efficiencies of that kind, Ostrom tells us a very different counter narrative, that actually economies of scale can mask all sorts of other kinds of missed opportunities. And that leads me to the third thing that I'd like to talk about, which is if you give local areas more autonomy, if you scale down and decentralize, if you allow self-governance of commonses or shared assets, and we explore all these things a lot in the report that came out last year, something else starts to happen. And this may be the most difficult pill for people to swallow, given how things have normalized in this country. This is more of a challenge, I think, than the other two. The challenge is that if you allow those things to happen, you also end up with more variation between places. You end up with a huge diversity of different approaches being taken out in different spots. That's because context dependency is really important for the case for this kind of localized approach. Now, that can run against a lot of the orthodoxy of what we consider to be good approaches to policymaking and good approaches to the universal provision of public services. Universalism doesn't get sacrificed by this approach, but allowing experiments to play out in local places, allowing a very context-dependent and very contextually informed delivery approach to play out in local places will lead to different approaches in different places. And that is the experimentation that leads also to innovation, to creativity. So instead of the orthodoxy, which is something like you get your smartest people into a room in Whitehall, you come up with a killer policy, and then you scale it out as fast as you can. No, no, no. The Ostrom lesson here is you try something, you let it sit with the complexity of the society in which it must function. You see if it works, you iterate on it, and you don't just scale it up just because it seems to be working in one place. You learn lessons from it, but you don't necessarily try and lift and shift it to everywhere else in the country. That's a really tough challenge for the way that things usually work in this country. So there's three assumptions there that I think Ostrom disrupts. The idea of how local communities won't be able to self-govern, the idea that you need economies of scale, you need to be centralized in order to function well, and the idea that you need a universal and normalized and common experience across a whole nation or a whole international context. I think those are three things that Ostrom pretty much blows out of the water. There's a case for all of those things, but there's a counter narrative too. And all of those, I think, add up to a pretty strong case for community power too.
Thank you so much, Simon. I mean, you just summarized 50 years of Elinor Ostrom's work in a few minutes there, which is an incredible achievement. Just a quick question back to you. I mean, as you said, she died a few years ago. She was very, very respected throughout her career. And as you said, she won the Nobel Prize, first woman to win the Nobel Prize for economics. But she never really cut through into the orthodoxy, the sort of market orthodoxy and the state orthodoxy, or as Jessica and I called it, the market and state paradigm, remained dominant for years. Why do you think there's so much growing interest in her now? She is suddenly coming back into fashion, or maybe coming into fashion for the first time, really. Why do you think that is, and why has it taken so long for her ideas to break through?
Well, it's definitely because I wrote this report last year. No, it's because well, there's a few different reasons why this might be the case. I think something that you summarized, I mean, look who I'm talking to. I'm telling grandmothers how to suck eggs when I tell you and Jess that there's a growing crisis in the provision of public services and demand that leads us to question that pendulum swing from market through state to market orthodoxy again and again. So the idea that there is something else, something, as Elinor Ostrom put it, beyond markets and states, a set of approaches that actually can coexist with those families, with those models, but actually have a very different basis and allow much more autonomy and much more democracy and co-production in the way that things get done. I think that has growing appeal given the strictures and the challenges we face. It's not a coincidence either that for the latter part of her career, before she died, Elinor Ostrom was deeply, deeply focused on challenges to do with environmental sustainability and in particular climate change. The idea of the global commons of our climate and how we manage it and how we need to work small and get bigger, I think that's an idea that has enormous power to it. And I think that we're just starting to think about what that looks like in practice. So the challenges we face, from the pandemic to the climate change crisis to the other crises in economic inequality around the country, all of them are potentially amenable to just a fresh set of ideas. And that's part of the power of the community paradigm as a piece of work, but it's also this powerful take from Elinor Ostrom as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Simon. We're now going to hear from Grace Pollard, Senior Researcher at New Local, and as I mentioned, one of the co-authors of our really good report, Community Power, The Evidence. Over to you, Grace.
Thank you, Adam. So as Adam says, our report, Community Power, The Evidence, came out a couple of weeks ago. So I just wanted to share with you some of the insights that we got from that. So this piece of work was looking at the really rich diversity of community power approaches that exist today, and really focusing on the impact that this is already having for people, for communities, and for public services. So obviously this whole conference has been about community power, but it's probably worth just touching on here how we understood community power in this piece of work. So for us, it was about capturing a really wide range of practices, approaches, and initiatives, from neighbours coming together to address a local issue, to a council initiating a citizens' assembly, to perhaps people in frontline public services finding new ways to collaborate actively with the people accessing those services. So we take this quite broad definition, but what we see as common to all of this is the principle that communities have the knowledge, the skills, and the assets, which mean they themselves are well placed to identify and respond to the challenges they face and ultimately to thrive. So for us, that's the principle of community power that really binds all these approaches together. And through looking at this really diverse set of approaches, we were able to find 3 clusters of ways that more power is being handed to communities. So I just wanted to run through those briefly here. So the first one was around approaches that are focused on community decision making. So that's the deliberative and participatory tools which are really meaningfully allowing communities to be involved in local decision making. So there would be thinking of things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, participatory budgeting, approach that I know will be familiar to a lot of people here. There's a second set of approaches which we call collaboration with communities. And here we're really talking about some of the ways public services are working with communities as equals in order to gather the vital insights from them and to share this in how they design and deliver services. So here we're often thinking about things like strength and asset-based approaches and also co-production. And then the third cluster of approaches we term building community capacity and assets. And these are the approaches and initiatives which are really focusing on equipping communities with the skills and the resources so that they can really meaningfully participate in local action. And to name just a few approaches here, we're thinking of things like asset transfer, approaches to mobilise communities, and for example, asset-based community development as well. So by bringing together this really wide range of approaches, initiatives, practices, we've been able to identify some of the ways that community power is already having a positive impact. And in the report, we identified 6 main areas of impact. Now, anyone that's seen the report would know it's quite long, so I'm not going to run through that in loads of detail here because we really want to open this up to discussion. But each of those 6, they kind of come in 3 pairs. So I just want to run through those now and just give a little bit of an insight into what we were looking at. So we found that community power can improve individual health and well-being, and also that it can strengthen community well-being and resilience. So approaches here are really focusing on this idea that people need to be active participants in all efforts to improve their health and well-being, and that through involving people in decision-making locally, through supporting them with the resources, with the social infrastructure that I know has been a really important discussion over this last few days, that we can really enable communities to take action to improve their health and well-being. The second pair of approaches impacts I point to is approaches that are enhancing democratic participation and boosting trust, and also approaches that are really focusing on building community cohesion. So here we're seeing deliberative and participatory approaches being used to engage people in dialogue around complex local decisions, but also as a way to really start building legitimacy in how those decisions are made. And we're also seeing approaches that are focusing on building cohesion, but not top down, very much like ground up approaches to build cohesion within communities. And then the final pair of impacts I'd point to here, focusing particularly on public services. We found evidence of embedding prevention and early intervention into public services, and also some evidence around generating financial savings. So this is where we're looking at approaches where the public sector are really working in partnership with communities, drawing on their vital knowledge, skills and insights as a route to build more sustainable and prevention-focused services. And while it can be difficult to capture this, we do try to explore in the report some of the evidence here that this does generate financial savings. So that's a bit of an overview of the impact. And I'm then going to hand over to Jessica, who's going to speak a little bit more about some of the challenges we looked at in the second half of the report, and really how we can think about mainstreaming community power and how it will more widely influence policymaking and public services.
Thanks very much, Grace. And Grace gave a terrific kind of overview of the range and depth of evidence that exists about community power and exists about the impact it's having in people's lives. Simon's obviously given a brilliant overview of the kind of decades-long empirical research of Eleanor Ostrom that proved that communities can and do run their resources more efficiently than the market and state. So the challenge for us on this evidence report was, why is this evidence of small impacts, but the sum total of which is pretty significant, why isn't this cutting through to the decision makers and the powers that be in our country? Why are we still so resistant to change? For those of you who were here yesterday, Andy Burnham gave quite a kind of brutal metaphor about Westminster as a crack house in which it was full of people behaving in strange ways, addicted to the same behaviours, which is obviously quite a blunt way of putting it. But as someone who has worked in Westminster in the past, before I was in this role, there are echoes of it in terms of, if you're talking about pushing power out of the centralised institutions of this country, if you're talking about saying these institutions, this centralised state has to let go and people have to be given more power and control and autonomy, the questions that come back to you, the demands that come back to you is prove it works. How do I know it works? Well, I'm sorry, but does it save money? I'm sorry, but is it, tell me why it works. And somehow the evidence that it works is either too small scale or it's too subjective. It's about well-being, it's about our sense of belonging, it's about happiness, it's about things that are tangibly really important to people, but somehow they don't cut the mustard in policy terms. There's not enough evidence there to input into a business case investment plan that would shift investment and change things. So, I mean, it's been a kind of passion of mine to be a localist, to be devolutionary, to want to talk about community power, to want to identify and work with the role of community power. Those who are advocates of community power relish its innate messiness, grassrootsness, organicness, but sometimes that rubs up in a difficult way against the way we do policy and the evidence that's required to shift the system. So if I just ask, my colleague Francesca is going to share her screen and she's going to put up the grid that we put together as part of the part of the research that we did. For me, this just spells out what we term the evidence paradox, that we say community power is trapped in. So on the right side of the column is the nature of community power and the qualities that it possesses. On the left side of the column are the nature of what constitutes good evidence in the current system, what we call the state market hybrid system. And what we mean by an evidence paradox is that there's a deep frustration on behalf of people who do community power, who practice community power, who live community power, that the very nature of what they do isn't recognised. So by being required to prove efficacy, they are basically being asked to prove their value, prove their worth according to measures that aren't set up to capture their value, aren't set up to recognise their worth. So whereas, for example, outcomes might be qualitative, the system demands quant, the system demands data. Where outcomes might happen and take place over the longer term, the system demands immediacy, the system demands savings in year or within an electoral cycle. Simon's talked about how small scale can have massive impact, but the system wants large scale for efficiency. And you can kind of read for yourself the different, the kind of opposing ends of things. But for me, this is where a lot of the frustration kind of can happen, that you can be trying to prove the nature, the impact on well-being, the impact on place and belonging, cohesion, all these kind of intangible things, but they're incredibly tangible for people's lived experience. But if you can't translate that into policy terms that the kind of treasury-dominated system recognises, it isn't enough to cut the mustard. And we see, for one other one that I think is really powerful, is this kind of trend towards uniformity in the current system, but the pluralism of community power type approaches that by definition they're different in different areas. They've grown organically, they've responded to the particular circumstances of a place. And what you can see sometimes is, sometimes an area will kind of break through in terms of people will say there's a really interesting innovation going on there. So whether it's kind of Wigan doing the Wigan deal or Preston doing community wealth building, when these policy initiatives grab the imagination of our central national decision makers, often what ends up happening is they say, well, why can't everywhere be like Wigan? Why can't everywhere be like Preston? And for us, that's the wrong question. The question is, why can't the conditions exist in every area in order for them to have their own innovations, for them to experiment, for them to grow their own approaches? Why can we not have a system that enables this kind of pluralism, this rich diversity? Why does success have to be scaled up and made uniform? It's totally counter to the innateness of community power and community power type approaches. So I guess for us, what we were trying to do with this was just set out, not that everything on the left side is bad. There's a role for stuff on the left side. There's a role for data. There's a role for understanding things on those levels. But we need to also begin to kind of broaden how we recognise value in the system to respect the nature of community power. So on the one hand, we argue community power type approaches do have to prove their worth within the current system. It's good to be doing evaluations. It's good to be telling stories about impact. It's good to be articulating the real life outcomes and stories that people experience. The sum total of these stories is incredibly powerful. But there's a deeper question as well, which is how can we shift the system as itself so that the logic of the system enables the community power to flourish, and really the finance and accountability, the kind of where the money flows, how the money incentivizes certain sets of behaviours, and how accountability are kind of at the core of our existing system. And often evidence serves to reinforce largely the status quo rather than challenging the status quo and opening up a broader definition of value. And that broader definition of value would overcome the evidence paradox, because it would make space to recognise the rich diversity and rich impacts of community power. So just to finish, we might get onto some of this in the discussion, but in our evidence report, we talked about place-based budgets as a different way of incentivising collaborative behaviours between institutions in place, making it much more shifting the logic of the system so that it becomes logical to invest in longer-term community-based infrastructure and community relationships. So to try and take out some of the kind of Whitehall vertical silos and create more horizontal collaboration around places. And we also looked at how you would potentially begin to shift this kind of Treasury Green Book dominance in our policy thinking towards understanding kind of cross-cutting wellbeing measures that focus on things that are meaningful to people. So, for example, the capacity of people to lead fulfilling lives that cut across silos of health, housing, work, and really begin to kind of galvanize public servants working in a place to work much more differently with people. So I guess our challenge was, within the current system, how can community power maximize its impact? But it exists at the fringes largely of the current system. It's outside the logic of the current system. So how can we also, on a deeper level and a longer term basis, begin to shift the system so that it recognizes and ideally incentivizes this, so that it's not innovative, pioneering behavior, it's mainstream, it's absolutely what's at the core of our public service infrastructure. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're getting some really interesting questions coming through in the chat. So Emily Bradbury had a great question, I thought. She says that she lives in an area that hasn't really got the community power message. So she wants to start fighting for it, campaigning for it in her area. What are the sorts of typical objections and pushback that she's likely to face? And how might she take some of those on? She sort of wants to be forewarned, basically, so she can take on the inevitable objections. Does anybody want to jump in on that?
Sorry.
Go on, Jess.
Sorry, I haven't seen the actual question, but so in a place, the objections.
What are the obvious objections to community power that you need to be aware of?
So I think there's a real assumption that community power is going to be about a load of middle class sharp elbows that would take control of the agenda anyway, and you're just going to kind of set them off to have more control, and first come first serve kind of thing. But actually our work and a lot of the case studies in the reports we've been publishing really focus on, I guess, the understanding of power and agency as kind of lacking in how we talk about poverty and lack of social justice in this country, and the fact that if you are living in a deprived area and you have difficult circumstances, you have a lack of agency vis-a-vis the system. And thinking about understanding the rich potential of communities, the ability of the individual to understand and have insights into their own challenges, into their own lives, to articulate what they need, and the different levels of support they just might need in order to fulfill their potential. But there's a traditional assumption that community organisation is only something that kind of middle class people will do. But actually, I think this is utterly at the core of a very progressive agenda for really recognising, if we want to level up in this country, if we want to do something seriously about inequality, the people who are currently on the receiving end of a lot of this poverty policy and on the receiving end of things need to be at the forefront of it. So I think it's a really exciting way of looking incredibly differently about social challenges that have been beyond our ability to tackle for decades.
Thanks, Jess. Another issue, I mean, this is it's come up in the chat here as a question, and put this to Simon. One of the classic objections to community power and to devolution more generally is this problem of the postcode lottery. And Ostrom was a unrepentant decentralizer, let 1,000 flowers bloom. How would she, do you think, respond to that criticism, where you're now going to end up with all sorts of different levels of service delivery, different standards, different levels of equality, things like that in different places?
Well, Ostrom would respond to that question more radically than I would. Ostrom was, as you say, the hardcorest of the hardcore, and she would have said, you know what, you vote with your feet. May 1,000 flowers bloom. You don't like the look of the flower over here, you go over to the flower over there. And that's how things change and improve. You've got autonomy, and as long as your rights are respected and there's minimum standards of a certain kind that are safeguarded through some kind of mechanism, let's do this. And the postcode lottery thing comes up all the time. That you probably hear that phrase if you try to start making the case for these approaches in your locality. That's a good answer to the last question too. And a lot of the stuff that Jess was saying just now, I think, is completely relevant here, because someone came up to me shortly after the report launched last year. Talked to me on Zoom shortly after the report launched last year, and said, don't you care about things being crappy in one place and good in another. And I said, of course I do. But we've ended up in this weird mindset where we pretend that postcode lotteries, where bad differences from place to place don't exist right now. Of course they exist right now. They're everywhere right now. And our solution far, far, far too often isn't to level up. We're all talking about leveling up all the time. It's to level down. We find a deliverable minimum standard, and we try and stick to that standard. And that's when middle-class people with sharp elbows, the folks that Jess was just talking about, get to improve on that because they're in relatively stronger areas and more developed areas. That's where the postcode lottery arises in the current system. So I think there's a real case to be made for, yes, you have to ensure standards. You have to make sure that there's national targets. This is all completely right and national in a national democracy. But there has to also be a case for allowing a degree of autonomy, just a little bit more autonomy for the communities that are in a position to do a better job because they're local experts, because they understand what's needed in the design, the delivery, the disposition of local assets and public services. That almost nowhere else in the world is that a radical proposition that gets countered with the concept of a postcode lottery. Almost nowhere else in the world. And I think that's really telling.
Thank you. Somebody quite rightly put in the chat that it's obviously easier for wealthier people to vote with their feet than poorer people. I don't think you were endorsing Ostrom's particularly radical point of view there. That's just a particular argument that she made, but I think you have a much sort of more broader, subtler approach than that. Grace, one of the questions that's come up in the chat is about what do you do in conditions where there are genuine differences of interest or opinion within communities? Because there is a sort of assumption that we can always come to a consensus, but sometimes there are genuine differences of opinion. Have you come across anything in your work and your experience of real efforts about how you address that, how you overcome real differences within communities? You were talking about cohesion a bit just before, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Adam. So I think it's difficult, and I think it is important that that's acknowledged. I think through some of the work we've seen, there's a variety of different ways to go about approaching that. I think an important thing to say, there's a lot of conversation about ensuring something that comes out really strongly from a lot of learning from a lot of these approaches is ensuring that there's time to build trust, to build capacity, to invest in social infrastructure. And I think that's really important to draw out, because that's making sure, and I think it maybe gets back to the issue we're talking about here about whether this is just something that middle class communities get involved with. So I think firstly, that's making sure that everyone can get involved in this. And so these aren't approaches that you can just drop down in an area and you're going to really be able to quickly deliver it. You've got that capacity, that time, that infrastructure that everyone can be involved is really important. So I think that's the first point to make. I guess the obvious places to look where you have difference would be to approaches like deliberation. That's not necessarily always about just not everyone's going to agree on one thing, but it's about that process of conversation. And I think in a lot of the deliberative and participatory approaches we looked at, and also approaches around building cohesion, it was about creating space for that dialogue, and that perhaps that's what's often missing at the moment. But creating space for dialogue, yes, everyone won't agree, but it allows the space for people to understand different points of view, and you may also get some consensus building there. So I think there's interesting examples from things like citizens' assemblies where you take quite contentious issues that perhaps how they're normally handled, and the sort of public dialogue on those could be quite difficult, quite divisive, and then in a deliberative space you actually do start to build consensus around them. And I think that's particularly interesting, looking to things like environmental issues, air quality, debates that can often be really difficult for communities with really quite strong different opinions. I think deliberation is a really interesting, it doesn't have all the answers, but that's a really interesting area around consensus building.
Thank you so much, Grace. And I think many of people at the conference may have had their own experience of being involved in those sorts of deliberative sessions. And if any of you haven't been involved, do try and attend one, because when you go to one of those sessions that actually is really well organized, really well thought through, can be an amazing driver of consensus. It's sort of quite moving, really, even in circumstances of quite extreme differences of opinion. another question for Simon, but Jessica may want to come in on this as well, but this is something I know that's really at the forefront of Simon's mind at the moment because we're developing a project on it. Does community power challenge the behaviour of politicians and the way politics works? I think you're going to say yes to this, but I'm just going to hand over.
Yes. And well, I'll add a bit. So yes, it does. And I think a lot of the stuff that Grace just described, the potential power when it's well done of deliberative approaches, of more participatory formats, these can only play out at quite a small localized scale. This is why we keep going on about it, maybe. But I think there's also a kind of a countervailing type of model of democracy that I think is a real, it has a real incompatibility issue with some of these approaches. When we talk about representative democracy in this country, we really do have a very minimalist idea of what it means to be a democratic citizen and what it means to have expectations of our representatives. And now that we're starting to popularize these more inclusive, more participatory, more small scale and localized democratic exercises, the extent of that citizenship, the depth of participation, the way it leverages local expertise and helps to bring people up to a level where they can all engage properly in the conversation, that is a kind of an intrinsic challenge to the minimalist, very wide but very shallow model that we usually see playing out that informs the behavior of politicians. And all the incentives we see that feed into the behavior of politicians and the way that national politics plays out, those incentives have evolved in that very wide, very shallow world. So there's an incompatibility issue. And as the community power version, as deliberative and highly localized democracy picks up speed, as I would expect it to do, given how much loss of trust there is now in our democratic institutions and our political representatives, I think that mismatch is going to become more and more evident. So there are challenges being posed here. How does a representative, be it a councillor or an MP, how does a representative really respond to, take account of the conclusions of a deliberative session, of a citizen's assembly, of a citizen jury? How do they not treat it as they sometimes, I'm afraid, treat the consultation exercises that we're all quite used to, and just sort of chuck them out, babies in the bathwater? Because you can do that, because people aren't really paying attention. Well, when you're at a smaller scale and people are more involved, people are paying attention, and you can't operate that way anymore. And so there are fundamental challenges here to the way political parties work, to the way political representatives work, to the way politics plays out at the national and local scale.
Thank you. And I should have said that question came from Kirstine Rowe about politics and politicians. Jess, you may have some thoughts on that, but you might want to respond to that. But could I just also, because we've only got 3 minutes left, just put one other question which came in, which seems relevant to what you were talking about, which was, you've got that grid. The grid is great, but there's some people would look at the community power side of the grid and say, well, that's all fluffy stuff. That's more fluffy. And Kat has asked, how do we address that? How do we deal with this criticism that the way you're judging community power and community power itself is a bit fluffy? It doesn't get down to the really hard issues of data, economics, that sort of thing.
Sure. I mean, that's another one of the kind of criticisms of the agenda, that it's kind of soft and fluffy. But I don't understand why that is kind of our lives. I don't understand why that would be the case. It's what we kind of feel and experience, and there are some hard consequences to it. It shows up in the data when this stuff isn't happening. But it's about how our system recognizes and responds to value. So our system is very good at identifying hard costs, really bad at capturing real value and what matters to people. And if our system can become better at that and incentivize that, and incentivize public servants to work in different ways, incentivize the whole system throughout to recognize what actually matters to people, that would be really important. And I think, just linking back to the question that was put to Simon on democracy, we've got a real crisis in our democracy at the moment, but it's often not visible because our representative system of democracy does a really good job of hiding it, and it only rears its head when we do something like ask people in a referendum what they think, and they go and slap you in the face and give you a really unexpected answer. And it turns out when they have the opportunity, they want to shock the establishment to the core because they think the system isn't working for them. So this is something that we can kind of ignore at our peril, write off as soft and sort of like fluffy and on the edges. But you sort of know that it's going to bubble away, and people do feel that they don't have control in their lives in a number of different ways. And I think that unless mainstream, and that's why I think it isn't a challenge to politicians, it should be an enabling force to politicians, particularly those who operate in the mainstream. Unless we can close the gap between government and the governed in practical, tangible ways for people, increasingly dark forces step into those spaces. Populist politics is on the rise. There will be people that want to craft easy narratives and easy answers to why people don't think they've got control in their lives, to give people a sense of agency and control. So I think that it can be kind of, these things can be written off as soft and fluffy at our peril, but other people will take hold of those soft and fluffy things and create monsters out of them. So I think this is really important for politicians to take seriously, and it's a way of them working in much more efficacious way with people.
Thank you so much. I love the comment from Karen Cheney in the chat that this supposed fluffy stuff actually saved many communities, neighbourhoods, and probably lives as well during the pandemic. So not so fluffy after all. Well, thank you, all of you, for that. I hope I found that incredibly interesting and useful. And I talk to you all every day about this stuff, but I hope everyone else did. And the fact that I think at one point we had 200 people actually turning up for the final session of a conference, which is not a bad thing. So it shows how much interest there is in the work that all of you are doing and in the community power message. So thank you so much for that.